I'm going to start us off. And it's a very serious note that we're starting the show today. As you all know, tomorrow is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. It's an event that dramatically changed the face of American culture, how we live our lives here. And so it's important to kind of dig into this, dig into the history of this, and talk about the legacy that has been left from this, especially in this surveillance age that we're now living in. So I wanted to just talk about that for a little bit. There was this great article in Wired that sort of dug into the legacy of this surveillance state, the fact that this has kind of become normalized now. We have these temporary measures that are put in place in the aftermath of something horrific, and then that's sort of taken advantage of, and these temporary emergency measures sort of persist. So of course, we're talking about things like the Patriot Act, which really became this invasive part of all of our lives, just ended up creating so much blanket surveillance for American culture. So, all of that is something that on the show we cover it regularly. We're talking about this through the lens of sovereignty in terms of money, sovereignty in terms of data. And this is something that is quickly being eroded away. But there are people who are creating technologies, and decentralized technologies in particular, that are helping give us back some of that. But I wanted to just throw this to the group to start off with. This is such a momentous event, anniversary for everyone in America who especially lived through this. And it's just really left such a scar. But then I think the worst part of the scar may be just this legacy of just overreach and how normalized it has become. All of the cameras that you see up, all of the boards that you see up, everything just kind of like freedom's becoming curtailed. And also, in the wake of COVID as well, I think there are a lot of similarities there. The Wired article brought up that, just talking about how a lot of people, residents start to frame threats and use COVID as an excuse to eliminate things they don't like, eliminating things like skateboarding and drug use and music, and putting this all through the frame of safety threats. So it's important as a society to kind of look at this and decide whether this is the world we want to live in, something that sees these threats and just tries to stamp out things that we don't like. But Zach, I'm going to throw it to you to start off with. A very, very heavy topic to start. I'm sorry about bringing that to the table. Just thought it's important to mention on this anniversary.
Yeah, certainly worth reflecting on. I think everyone, has their own personal stories from that day that, stick with us 2 decades later. And I think this weekend will be one of much reflection. It is interesting to think of financial surveillance and the way that Bitcoin has emerged out of that context, right? Bitcoin was created in the wake of the financial crisis we often hear, but it was also, pseudonymous by design, I think in response in part to some of the security measures that were implemented and have remained since 9/11. So to think of this system as a potential alternative to some of the financial surveillance that we see, along with sort of the physical world surveillance that we also live through on a daily basis, it's interesting to think just how much crypto has been influenced by 9/11, and it would be interesting to unpack that further, I think. But it's really interesting to think about what a pseudonymous by design system means in a world that was shaped in these past 2 decades largely by surveilling activity online. And I think some of the cypherpunks, saw the downsides of that early. As early as the early 90s, these people were talking about, okay, when everything's online, it's going to be much more easy to surveil our every waking movement, and especially how we spend our money. So interesting to think about how these two major events, 9/11 and Bitcoin, are in dialogue with each other. Here we are in 2021 still talking about it. So lots to reflect on. But, we could go any number of ways with this. I'll toss it down to Will for his thoughts.
Yeah, just I guess on a historical note, tomorrow is extremely significant. That doesn't need to be said again. But I think just for younger folk who didn't live through that moment or have vague memories of it, it's interesting that they live in a world where the consequences of that day are just very palpable. You have online surveillance, and then there's even banking surveillance nowadays. I know the Biden administration is moving forward, at least the Treasury is moving forward with some new amendments to how banking information is tracked, going down to as low as even $600 per transaction being tracked by the Treasury, which is pretty startling. And a lot of this has historical tiebacks to the war on terror and acts of terror committed on U.S. soil. And so we have those historical happenings have effects today. And I think a lot of people who are using these applications are really fun. They're using NFTs, they're using DeFi applications. Those products came out of that moment, just like you said, Zach, because there was a need for some sort of digital freedom of coming out of all the aggression and violence that happened during that period. And now people are using those technologies today. So I guess just on a historical note, it's interesting to see how things kind of tie together. Jen, I'll throw it down to you.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect back. I think everyone who was alive during that time, Zach, you mentioned, we can all remember what we were doing on that day. And humans are emotional beings. And I think when we reflect on the event and what's happened since then, we can see how that fear and emotion of the events of that day were weaponized against us leading up to today. And I think as we start to heal as a society, and the article mentioned this at the end, and we start to gain access to more information. I mean, if you think about when 9/11 happened, we didn't have as much access to information as we do now. At least the general public didn't. We weren't empowered with the information to really critically think about what was happening around us. And as we get that and we start to gain more access on a mainstream level to some of these DeFi products that both Will and Zach and Naomi, you've mentioned so far in this segment, I think we'll start to see society shift for good, I hope, and start to push back on some of those surveillance measures that were put in place.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic for sure, but just worthwhile noting that when governments come out with these temporary emergency measures, you should always look at it with a critical eye and just think, how long will the emergency last? Because it's very clear that they can make them last a very long time. So just having a critical eye when those things get passed.